going here. We seem to have a number of people that have entered the room, and if everyone can hear me clearly, I see a few of our speakers' heads nodding, so that's a good sign. My name is Jeanette Menzies, and I'm Canada's ambassador to Iceland. It is my great pleasure to be here today as part of the first of our Canada-Iceland webinar series as part of the 2023 series, following what we saw as a very successful and popular series that took place throughout 2022. I believe we had 6 webinars in total that attracted more than 1,300 participants, and then of course an unknown number that listened to them after the fact. So we have felt that there's great interest in the number of different topics that we've been addressing and looking at, and this is a broader cooperation that we do along with our partners, Polar Knowledge Canada and the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network. As you know, today's conversation is focused on the questions around gender data and decolonization in the Arctic. I was lucky to participate in a workshop on this very subject last week to address this key issue, which is one of the major challenges faced by Northern communities in understanding the realities faced by Arctic peoples, is this lack of sufficient gendered intersectional data. We'll come back to some of the conversation around our workshop that took place last week at the University in Akureyri, but I think we'll jump right into a bit of a presentation and conversation to stimulate our discussion by Chris Andersen. And Chris is Michif from the Parkland region of Saskatchewan in Western Canada. He's the professor and dean of the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and the co-author with Dr. Maggie Walter of the Indigenous Statistics, a quantitative research methodology. He is a member of Statistics Canada's Advisory Committee on Social Conditions. I had a chance to look at his slides yesterday, and I personally am really excited to hear this conversation because I know it's going to open my mind to new ways of understanding data. So Chris, I'll turn it to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy days to, excuse me, come and listen to us talk about this today. A couple things I want to say just before I get started is it's slightly odd for me when I got the invite because my expertise isn't in Indigenous gender and data, and certainly not in the Arctic, but I do know a whole lot about how people tend to think about data and some of the complications that are involved in thinking about that in that way. Finally, before I get started here, I'll apologize for my faded background here. I'm on sabbatical right now in Ottawa, and I'm in a small apartment, and this basically is serving as a pantry, so it looks a bit like a prepper lounge if I was to sort of give the full backdrop on it, so hence the faded background. So if you can go to the next slide. So I want to talk for a bit about 3 common misunderstandings or understandings that people have about data. First, the idea that data are objective reflections of an underlying reality, which is of course false. Data don't simply reflect reality, they also help produce it. And what I mean by that is when Statistics Canada comes out with its information about whether Canada is getting older or younger, whether we're letting more or less immigrants in, whether Indigenous people, as Indigenous people, we're getting worse or better. Those are particular discourses that get picked up in broader society, and it helps shape the way in which we think about our everyday lives. And we often tend to think, and certainly demographers tend to think about data as just information that we are collecting that's already out there. And of course, we shape the way in which we collect some information and not others. So data are not objective reflections of an underlying reality. Next. Secondly, there's an idea that data are neutral. This is also false. All data, it doesn't matter what kind of data we're talking about, are all socially and culturally embedded. And because of that, they're always political. And one of the arguments that Indigenous peoples have long made about data about us is that we haven't been involved as partners in the way in which the data gets conceived, collected, interpreted, analyzed, and disseminated or communicated. And of course, that powerfully shapes the ways in which stories get told about us. And we've, until recently, had very little say in being able to tell our own stories, nor even collect the data to shape the kinds of stories that we tell, but very often data are seen as neutral. And there's big problems when we see things as neutral in that way. And thirdly, there's this idea that data are things. And what I mean by that basically is that we tend to look at numbers and we just think, well, that's the numbers speak for themselves. But of course, because data are political, they are processes. They involve all these different institutions and discourses and practices and expertise and competencies and competitions and personal investments and all these different actors who are plugged in various ways, all of whom are attempting to shape what the data looks like when it comes out the other end. It's helpful to think about this like a black box. And generally speaking, the way that this idea of a black box gets used is once things are seen to run the way that they're supposed to run, we stop looking into the box to see why they run the way they run. But it's important to think about data as processes rather than just things that kind of appear out of nowhere. Next slide, please, Per. So 3 principal axioms of Indigenous data sovereignty that I want to put in front of mind for people as we have a conversation about this is first, data are always political, right? They always involve some type of interpretation. They always involve situations in which folks are in unequal positions and attempting to make arguments about which data should be used. So they're always political. And the thing that's really important to realize about data is that good data aren't the result of some type of technical perfection. Good data come from the quality of the partnerships that produce them. And I gave a talk at Statistics Canada a while ago now, where I made a differentiation between what I call cake bakers and cake decorators. And I sort of talked about the fact that Statistics Canada spends a lot of time decorating cakes, but doesn't spend as much time thinking about the ingredients that go into baking the cake. Somewhat unfair on my part, given all the excellent work that Statistics Canada does in terms of making sure that, say, for example, the census that they produce comes out the way that it does. But it is worth us thinking about the ways in which we should be thinking less about the objective technical perfection of data and thinking more about the policy relevance of the data, right? So moving away from what kinds of stories can we tell using the data that we have and moving toward what do we want to know and what are the kinds of stories we do want to tell. Next slide. Sorry, next, yeah. So the broader point here is that it's very difficult to good data our way to good relationships. We should really be thinking about how to good relationships our way to good data, and bad relationships increase the possibility of bad data. A couple of months ago, I had a conversation with someone who was doing a research project who wanted to talk to me about what it would look like to put a Indigenous identifier for folks who are going through a provincial healthcare system. And her implicit question to me was, how can we get more Indigenous people to agree to kind of self-identify as Indigenous when they're going through the healthcare system? And I said, well, they shouldn't. And she said, well, what do you mean? How do we fix this if they're not willing to, if we don't have good numbers? And I said, if they don't trust what's being done with those numbers, then there's no point in giving you that information, because basically what that means when you're not in a good relationship is you've got a fully charged fire hose that's just sort of flapping all over the place. And good relationships are the ways that we ground numbers and ground statistics in ways that are helpful. Next point. And finally, I want people thinking about the fact that as Indigenous peoples, we have a right to our own data. I mean, this is a basic argument about Indigenous sovereignty, but we also have the responsibility. Data are our relatives, and collecting information comes with obligations and responsibilities. And by obligations and responsibilities, I don't just mean to collect the information in a good way. I mean to think about the ways in which the concepts that we use that end up turning into questions that we use to collect the information are in alignment with what we say our cultural values and political objectives actually are. If we think about data as our relatives, then we move away from this idea that the importance of data is that it's open and that it's interoperable, it's interchangeable, et cetera, and we start to think about the ways in which we can live in ethical and responsible relationship to that data. And so, having said all of that, I'll turn it back over to Jeanette, and we can have more conversation about this as we go forward.
Thank you, Chris. Can I ask Per if you can hear me? Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Chris, for that very great sort of opening remarks and views with your visuals on data. I've never heard a cake analogy with statistics, so that's a really unique way to think about things. It also brought back it linked to a number of the key messages that came through last week at the workshop on this very subject in Akureyri in Northern Iceland. One of the big points that was raised was, the idea that data is relationships, and you've certainly alluded to that when you talk about data actually being our relatives. It's not just relationships, it's our relatives, and therefore it comes with it obligations and responsibilities. And then another key point that was raised at the workshop last week was something that I've heard, and it's been repeated to me, and I want to keep hearing it, and I want to say it wherever I can, but the perspective from Northerners that nothing about us without us. And that came through in your remarks today, as well as all of the various comments that were received last week by the number of participants in the workshop. I wanted to also highlight an event that happened earlier last year, actually in 2022, where this topic was also discussed. And I think that we've seen a real resurgence in interest in the issues. And I'm pleased to see this being discussed in webinars like this, but also at very high levels. And at the annual Arctic Circle Assembly that takes place in Iceland, this topic has been included in different ways in the past, but this past year in 2022, it was actually included as a plenary discussion, which means that it was front and center, main stage. And the speakers in the panel were Canada's Governor General, Miss Mary Simon, who many of you in Canada are well familiar with, and the Prime Minister of Iceland. And so having those two women speak about these issues in the context of that conference with it was close to 3,000 people listening, I think was very significant. And I hope to see this type of discussion and this issue continuing in prominent spaces like that. I'd like to just get the chat box sort of thinking and moving, because I'm going to allow for a few remarks from our two other speakers, and then allow our participants to ask some questions, which either myself or Per will read out, and then we'll stimulate some discussion. But before I jump in to the next remarks, can I ask people to just put in the comments, if you'd like, where you are. I always find it interesting to see where our speakers are dialing in from. So if we can do that, just to get the chat box moving, and I'll say where I am. I can't spell Reykjavik fast enough. Alaska, Reykjavik, Anchorage, Nuuk. Okay. Maine. I won't read them all because I assume all of you are able to see this. It's a few longer entries too, so people can go back and scroll back to read. That's great. Thank you for everyone for letting us know where you are. That's just always of interest. So I'm going to go to our next speaker, who is someone who I've had the great fortune of working with and running into in the context of many different opportunities and jobs over the years. Bridget Larocque is an Indigenous resident of the Northwest Territories in Northern Canada, has extensive ancestral knowledge of the Northwest Territories and the broader Circumpolar world. I met Bridget, I don't remember what year I met you, but certainly it was when it's during all the work you've done with the Gwich'in Council International. So it's always great to speak with you and to hear your perspectives, and I will turn the microphone over to you.
Good day, everyone, and thank you, Jeanette. Yeah, let's not date ourselves with when we met, but it's always been a pleasure to work with you. And Chris, you're a hard act to follow. We certainly missed you at the data gathering workshop. You have such wealth and knowledge and such powerful insight. So I feel that I'm up to a challenge. But my comments will concentrate on the workshop on gender and disaggregated data in the Arctic region. And our story isn't any different from the provincial north and or Indigenous peoples globally. So the whole data workshop was to bring land-based knowledge holders, professional data statisticians, and people that really can bring about the challenges that we face with respect to data collection, gathering, sharing, and sovereignty. So the concept of nothing about us without us and leave no one behind, stemming from the concept of all my relations and a One Health holistic concept that concentrates on the storytelling methodology, and that it has to be humanistic and all-inclusive. This qualitative methodology has to tell a story that is truth grounding, that will benefit Indigenous peoples culturally, socially, psychologically, and environmentally. During our GF4 data challenges workshop, one of our participants who has been on this journey with us since inception, offered up the EMBLA principle, and that is to data gathering and sharing has to be equitable, fair and impartial, meaningful for the reason data is gathered, beneficial for the people it is to serve, legitimate for the people and the purpose, and all inclusive, going back to the people, culture, social, psychological, environmental. So doing data work from the heart and mind, concentrated on what do we have, what do we need, and what is feasible to achieve. Because data has to be equal, has to be about equal positioning and not always representing disparity and placing us as Indigenous peoples in a deficit position. So a lot of this thinking also stems from the book Chris and Maggie Walters co-authored, and that really resonated with us at the workshop, and trying to fit our story into policy that is relevant for us. But also I really appreciate when Chris talked about the relationship, because if we're not gathering and owning our data and taking up that responsibility, then the story isn't for us. It is about us, but from a outsider positioning and from a state position. So those are concerns that we have when we're talking about data and gender, because if we're only focusing on certain variables, then we're clearly at a disadvantage, because we're not getting the whole truth and the whole story of how to then benefit the people that data was gathered to benefit and improve the lives of. So I'll leave it at that. I look forward to any questions, and I do hope that I have some answers, or even put some greater thought into the reason data is important to Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. I would now like to introduce Kimberly Fairman. Apologies. Kimberly is the Executive Director at the Institute for Circumpolar Health Research, which is a community-focused approach to health policy. Kimberly has worked tirelessly to showcase the valuable contribution of Northern communities, practitioners, and Indigenous knowledge holders to the modern research agenda. Over to you, Kimberly.
Thank you, Jeanette, and thank you, Chris and Bridget, for setting this up. It makes it feel, really easy to sort of hit a couple of points here. But I think what was helpful is in Chris's presentation, this idea of the way that data is understood commonly, and how we need to think a little bit more critically about that understanding, particularly when we're talking about gender issues or Indigenous health issues. And I would just, a couple of things that I would highlight is that, a couple ways to think about this currently are in the areas of the infrastructure that exists, legislation that really focuses on data and the data ownership piece, as opposed to it being, managing data and having clear and accountable data governance that is about public trust and data literacy. So focusing on how data can be used or reused, and specifically by people who are involved right from the get-go in how the data is collected, what data is collected, and then have a say in how the data gets used as well. So, for me, when I think about how to do that differently, I think it's really key that that we collaborate with Indigenous governments and Indigenous communities, build that trust that Chris and Bridget have both alluded to, that would ensure that these communities are able to come to the table equitably and participate in the conversation around data and data use in a relationship that's based on partnership. I think also for me to think about how data should be really focused on the people and the individuals involved in the health system, but that sharing of data is improved. And, we can do that in ways that protect people and protect their information, but with the understanding that when data is used for the benefit of the people that it, has been, that it's representing, it becomes a very powerful tool to change the story around health, access to health services, and ultimately outcomes for people living in the North or Indigenous communities in particular. The only other, and this type of conversation, I think, is so important because it's encouraging exchange and sharing around gender and data use or Indigenous data use, and allowing the components of good data collection, storage, analysis, and use to be influenced by people outside of, the realm of health research or data collection and data use, and influenced in a way that's equitable.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'd like to open the chat now for any questions from the audience. And although all of you can see each other's names, and in the chat you can see where you're all from, but a few of us have been able to see, in fact, what some of you do. And I just wanted to highlight some of the different areas that we have in terms of people on this call today, because there's certainly a wide range. So I'm really curious the kinds of questions or conversation topics that may come up in our next phase. So in terms of participants, we have, of course, a number of Indigenous partners on this call, a number of science-based organizations that are involved in data, including Statistics Canada. There's a number of youth organizations that have signed up, including, I think we have Students on Ice on this call, as well as Planet Youth, which is based in Iceland, doing some great work on resilience and youth. We have a number of government departments ranging from northern, federal, municipal. We have a number of elders and retirees on the call, which I'm always really happy to see. And then, of course, a number of organizations that are involved in education and research, including universities and a range of companies. So that just gives you a sense of the very, very broad, wide-reaching interest in this subject. And so I'm going to just peek in the chat, and maybe I'll ask Per if you can manage. Per, do you want to read the questions when they come in? That would be great. And perhaps I will start with a question, and it's not necessarily for anyone in particular on the line, but I'm curious if you can share a best practice or a situation where there was a really positive partnership and a good example for people that involves data where, you know, personal information was protected in the manner that it needs to be, but that it was utilized in the right format that really involved the communities in which the data was taken from. Or you can spin that question to something else. Basically, I'm looking for some examples of that might inspire other work that people on the call might be involved with, that they can conceptualize an example.
Well, I could just give a quick example about maybe a model, not specifically around data use, but a model that I've used previously in research, which is a community of practice model, where we bring in community members and really establish, like define some of the terms that we're using in those like early discussions, talk about a terms of reference, like how they want to interact, what information they need, what support they need, and how they want to make decisions. We do a lot of this work before we even start getting into questions around, you know, for example, data collection or data use. And again, going back to Chris and Bridget's earlier comments about relationship. So, you know, and trust building. And I think these steps sometimes are overlooked or they're rushed. And in a way, it really prevents us to getting to, you know, when we do get to the point of talking about the actual work in front of us and the frameworks that we want to use, when we've taken the time to establish a relationship and trust, the work happens very quickly. And it happens in a way where people feel confident that we're moving in a direction that they can get behind. And if it starts to go in a direction that we hadn't discussed, that they can also feel confident that they can shape that. And so using that community practice model has always been one that, like for me, consistently gets good results when we start talking about reworking a framework that exists so that people feel equal in this discussion and equal in a partnership around, you know, the data collection or the research.
Thanks,
And
Kimberly.
maybe
Yep.
in support
Go ahead,
of,
Chris.
yeah, sorry, maybe in support of what Kimberly just said, I'll jump in and say, I'll give an example from post-secondary education, which is obviously what I'm most familiar with, and most of the people on this video call, certainly the Canadian folks, will be aware of this whole phenomenon of pretendians in the academy and the ways in which universities have been attempting to deal with that. And I was having a conversation with someone who was really excited about the retention rate of Indigenous students in the university between first year and second year, because of course post-secondary institutions in Canada are really worried about making sure that they recruit Indigenous students, but then they're also really worried about being able to retain Indigenous students once they get them. And I was chatting with this person, and they were very excited about the fact that they had a 90% retention rate between first years and second years. And so I said to them, well, no, that's actually a big problem. And they misunderstood me and thought I was saying that we shouldn't be going for 90, we should be going for 100. And I said, no, it should be lower than that. And they said, well, what do you mean? Why would we want it to be lower than that? I said, well, we don't want it to be lower than that. But the problem is that when you've got students who come from community, who've got all these different kinds of commitments, on any given year, university is not going to be the most important thing in their life. On the other hand, if you've got 90% of your students who are being retained between first year and second year, that means what you have basically is you've got a situation in which you've got largely white middle-class students with Indigenous ancestry who've begun to identify, who already have all the forms of social and political, social and cultural capital that they need to succeed in the university. And the person said back to me, well, then what would you suggest that we do? And I said, well, add another question to the question that we asked the students. Were you raised in community? And of course they wouldn't do that, not because they didn't want to, but because they wanted to make sure that they did it in a good way, to figure out kind of what question to ask, how to ask it, all that kind of stuff. So my point in giving this example is to go back to this idea that it's the good relationships that produce the good data. There's always going to be ambiguity in the data that we have. So it's not like there isn't a clear strike zone that if everyone gets in alignment and we all kind of chuck at the same time and hit the strike zone of the kind of data that we want, then everybody will be happy. Because the data is always going to be somewhat ambiguous, it becomes really important to think about, well, what does it mean to build a good relationship with somebody? And what it means, at least in a post-secondary context, is getting senior academic administrators who are willing to sit through the discomfort of engaging with Indigenous communities and Indigenous community leaders in a context where their university may have had nothing to do with those community leaders for the previous 100 years. So what does it mean to sort of be able to kind of sit with that discomfort, to think through how to act ethically and responsibly, to get out of the way of one's own personal feelings and feelings of shame and guilt, and think about a sense of public responsibility that building those good relationships actually produce. So Jeanette, I know I didn't really answer your question, but sort of in support of what Kimberly was saying, that's the important element, is what does it mean to think about and connect with Indigenous peoples as knowledgeable partners to be engaged with, rather than seeing us as problems to be solved.
Mhm.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I can see that all of you are talking about that importance of positive relations and partnerships and cooperation and working closely together. I see some chat starting up, which is great. I encourage people to keep adding in your questions, and I will turn to Per to read the first of those questions.
Thanks, Jeanette. Hi, everyone. Per from the Embassy of Iceland here in Ottawa. So Paula Gold asks a question, and then we'll get to one from Katrina Knuckleby after that. Paula asks, how can organizations and projects ensure inclusivity blind spots are mitigated? And how can they fix them if they're not mitigated to ensure higher quality data and therefore greater output? To the panel.
Who wants to talk about inclusivity and ensuring blind spots are mitigated?
Mhm.
Bridget?
Well, yeah, I think we're hitting on that already with respect to relationship building and collaboration and equal partnership. And I'll just make a note. I noticed that in the chat there was something connected to Arctic communities, and for myself, I live here in Yellowknife and I've been here since 96, but I'm originally from Inuvik, Northwest Territories. And when I get a phone call from Statistics Canada, then they, is there anybody in your home that's Indigenous? I say, yes, we are. And they'll say, oh, are you First Nations or Inuit? And I say, no, we're Métis. And then it's like, okay, thank you very much. And it's like, well, what was this all about? And so the concern we have is that we haven't seen surveys in our post office boxes. We haven't received any phone calls. And then the three territories are, represent 100,000 people. So, we're always the outlier and, asterisks that, this doesn't represent the three territories, sorry. So it really has to be a ground up and high level down process of relationship and collaboration. It's not enough to just find numbers. We talked about, data has to benefit community, and community has to take up ownership and responsibility. And so many communities aren't there yet. Some communities are very small in number. Some communities don't have the human capacity or the financial capacity, and nor are there supports out there at any extensive level to build up that capacity and build up that self-esteem and build up the education level that allows for that relationship building and responsibility. So when we talk about relationship, it really has to come from and be with community. And I really appreciate the story Chris was telling about post-secondary education too, and identity, because that is where we'll get the true story. When people can just self-identify, that doesn't mean that they are who they claim to be. So I'll leave it at that, and for Kim or Chris to Kimberly or Chris to respond to.
Perhaps we'll go to the next question, and then if Kimberly or Chris want to make any additional comments, we can add it to the next one as well. So over to you, Per.
Yeah, so Katrina Knuckleby, who is MLA for Great Slave and Yellowknife, says that, asks a related question. We see a real lack of data collection by our government in the north, and we have issues with privacy with such a small population. How do we go about dealing with that to build trust that's pretty eroded?
I mean, I get somewhat not frustrated by the question, because it's a totally fair and legitimate question around privacy, but to a certain extent it's connected to the idea of what do good kind of ethical, responsible, long-term relationships look like. I taught a class, I guess it was about a month ago at UBC. It was a 1-week intensive Indigenous data sovereignty class as part of a graduate certificate there. And one of the students asked me, why she was raised in community, was from a small community, an Indigenous woman. And one of the questions she asked was, well, why would we give up this information to people that we don't have a good relationship with? And she wasn't accusing me of making the argument that they should. She was making the point that the relationship of trust has to come first before the discussions around privacy and data and those kinds of things. You can't. It's difficult to go into a community, and I'm not suggesting that the questioner is in any way saying this, but it's difficult to go into smaller communities, especially with kind of an evangelical bent, and say that you need to give us this information, because part of the basis of Indigenous data sovereignty is that as Indigenous peoples, we get to make decisions about what parts of ourselves to give up in the context of information and which we don't. Because the thing that we often forget about data is that people who live in local context very obviously have all the information they need to make decisions in that local context. You know, I joke a lot that if you were to ask somebody to find somebody else on someplace on the earth, what's the easiest and most precise way to let somebody know where somebody else is? And inevitably someone will say, well, GPS. Yeah, it's GPS. But if you're from that area and you're in that area, you don't need GPS. You've got all the local information that you need in order to get that person to exactly where they need to be. So you remember where Uncle George and Auntie Cheryl hit that beaver on the way back from the dance and flipped the car? Okay, just past there, you remember the rock where Uncle Chubby hit that blood? You have all the local information you need. So the idea that we have to give up information to make it better, the question inevitably becomes, better for whom? You can say better for the community, but not if the community doesn't feel like they are benefiting from it. And so it's those relationships of trust that have to get built first before that's kind of the chicken and the egg thing, but it's those relationships have to get built first before the data discussions can happen in any real nuanced way.
Thanks, Chris. Bridget, please.
Yeah, I love how you landmark that knowledge, Chris, and for me as well, and I think what we're hearing at the data gathering workshop is that there's all this data out there or information out there that, Indigenous peoples have the highest rates of this, have the highest rates of that. And then, so we start wondering, well, where is this data coming from if we haven't been a part of the data collection? And then it's, well, who are you talking about? Are you talking about, Indigenous peoples in the Arctic? Are you talking about the Indigenous peoples in the provinces? Or are you talking about, the urban Indigenous people? So, from that perspective, we're just boxed in all kinds of different identifiers and variables. And so when we try to talk about inclusivity and trust and the collective, then we really have to go back to the community. And like Chris said, is, they know their story. And it's like when researchers have come in the past, we have armchair researchers and we have outsiders, and they come in and they gather up whatever questions they need answered, and then they leave. And they leave with the community's knowledge, but they also leave with a story that is from their bias and from their perspective. So, even as we're looking at, how we've survived or able to mitigate COVID-19, there again, there's communities that are identified in various articles that have been researched and literature reviews, more or less. And they talk about, communities that are, have huge social disparities. And then there, once again, it's coming from more or less a negative, as opposed to the capacity they had to keep themselves healthy and have limited to no COVID-19 cases. So I think we really have to think about, what do we mean when we talk about relationship and trust? And, that relationship has to be long-term. It can't be these one-offs just for a research project.
Thanks, Bridget. While we're waiting for more questions, I have one question that I want to ask, and it's maybe linked to a group of people that we don't maybe have speaking today, but youth attitudes towards some of these topics and conversations. Now, I'm not wishing to say that none of you are youthful. You're all very youthful, but if we were to get a sense of where youth are on some of these issues, and also how do things like social media complicate or facilitate data collection? And I imagine it brings up a lot of issues and problems, but it can also facilitate things as well. So just curious, any reactions there?
Maybe to add to that, Jeanette, I would, and there's no subtext behind this at all, but I'd be interested to know if anyone has comments on the Canadian census and how that data is collected, and if there's ways that could be improved based on your experience.
Thanks, Per.
I mean, I hesitate being the man to talk again, given that this is a session on gender and indigeneity in the North, but I would say that youth, a lot more than some of us slightly older folks. I'm in my 50s now, so I feel like I can say that have a lot more facility with understanding the different forms that data take in our society, and they're sort of awash in kind of the big data revolution in a way that very few of us probably are, and so they take all kinds of things for granted. Indigenous youth have very, very high rates of social media use. They do all kinds of amazing things with the various social media platforms that are out there. But there are all kinds of ways in which they, just as we, give up our privacy to the kind of the data mining elements of these big data companies that they're just simply unaware of, as most of us are unaware of. I think, Per, maybe to answer your question quickly, I think Statistics Canada does a much better job now than it did in the past, coming out of some of the commitments that it made in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the mid 1990s. I do think still that there's a need for discussion about increasing data literacy among Indigenous folks in our communities. I think very often people who already have data literacy kind of take it for granted. And so you get these technical committees that help to build questions, but sometimes you get situations with folks who don't know enough to know what they don't know. And so there isn't, and if you kind of grow up in a particular data system, like grow up professionally in a particular data system, then you end up, you know, I saw this really fascinating thing when I was doing research a while ago, where I was chatting with some Métis policymakers, and I said, well, you know, you guys must be really pissed off that the census can't differentiate the different meanings of Métis in the census. And they said, no, not particularly. And I said, why? Like, what? How does that not piss you off? And they kind of shrugged and said, well, because there's a certain amount of fudge factor that's built into this based on the relationships that we have with government policymakers. So they know if there's wild swings one way or the other, we're not going to get double or triple the amount of money we got last year to do something. But in the same way, we're not going to get, you know, a third of what we got last year, depending on, or from the last census, depending on what the census numbers say. So this is where kind of the good relationships sort of trump the actual data itself, because there's a built-in ambiguity to the data. But yeah, I do think that it's worth it to have discussions about data literacy and the amount of data literacy that we have in our communities and in our nations, and the way that impacts the kinds of partnership-based ethic that you can have with Statistics Canada, or kind of like how difficult it is to have an equitable partnership when there's that kind of widespread gap between levels of expertise.
Mm-hmm. And I could just jump in on that last point that Chris is making. I think it's also important for us to think about the capacity that exists in our own institutions and organizations to build relationship. There's a huge gap, right, in the system's ability to include people, right, in these conversations, and to increase the level of data literacy and the level of health literacy as well. I think, you know, one of the points, and Chris also mentioned this, but for Indigenous people, Indigenous communities that have been colonized, there is an inequity that exists on all levels in the social determinants of health. And this, until that is sort of addressed and we are able to come to the table as equal partners, there's always going to be this capacity piece that comes up. And then I just, you know, again, thinking about outcomes that we would hope for, I think this idea of the public in general having increased data literacy and being activated to be involved in the discussions around the use of data, or what data is collected and why. I heard an interesting comment once from somebody at Statistics Canada about how they constantly have to explain why they are asking these questions. And for me, that's a big sign, right? That if the relevance isn't obvious, then are we asking the right questions? You know, so having people involved in the design of the types of information that we're collecting, the data that we're collecting, and what questions will lead us in the direction of being able to make better policy decisions.
I like that, Kim, and Chris, you're so point on as well. A huge factor, I think, is how is the data benefiting us? And if we hear constantly that, well, you know, it may relate to increased funding, but funding sometimes isn't the answer. Money sometimes isn't going to improve the social disparities, because these are historic traumas that have to be you know, a healing process has to be in place, and a healing process that is community based as well. So money isn't always the answer, but certainly we need to ensure that money is community based and health based, and that it's a collective approach to, you know, the social, environmental, and psychological. So there's just so many components to what we want to consider as Indigenous well-being, community well-being. So those are all factors that come into play, and we have to figure out how we develop these relationships that are long-term and that are really meaningful for the community. That once the data is collected, and once the community says, okay, yes, you know, we could work with this, then that relationship has to be in place and the supports have to be in place. So it's not a one-off situation. And Katrina, I know you're talking about trust and government, and that's a huge concern, because government necessarily, regardless that you're in the Northwest Territories, and I'll use that for example, regardless that we're 50-50 supposedly Indigenous and non-Indigenous, we're not heavily represented in the government system. And that might be a good point too, because the government system is a bureaucracy that doesn't necessarily bring about well-being for the Indigenous peoples. So we really have to be cautious of where we venture and what relationships we build upon.
Thanks, Bridget. And a few of you have touched upon this final point, which Katrina has raised for those that have seen the chat, just around capacity building in northern communities, and specifically what type of capacity do we need to build in communities to take this ownership and control of the data, to take on the ownership and control. And I see, Chris, you and Katrina have gone back and forth on some of the models in other countries where some of this work is happening, and perhaps there's opportunities for some exchanging of lessons learned. But maybe I'll ask just the speakers if there's any final comments on that point before we turn to Hlynur to wrap us up. But maybe I'll start with Chris.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly, one of the things that I and my colleagues talk a lot about is we have no problems getting Indigenous youth interested in the idea of becoming a lawyer or becoming a teacher or becoming a what have you. Whether or not they become lawyers or teachers is, of course, another kettle of fish. But how do we make becoming data analysts more attractive? It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue in the same way as being a lawyer is, but we have plenty of lawyers. What we don't have is people who actually know how to create, collect, clean, interpret, and communicate data. And yet data is literally the language of state. It's literally the way in which we talk to state. How do we tell stories? How do we tell good stories with data? We have these unbelievable storytellers in our communities. How can we connect that storytelling tradition with the data tradition to think about how we can tell better stories in ways to get the state to listen in ways it doesn't now. So that's part of the issue as well.
Thank you, Chris. Bridget or Kimberly?
Yeah, I think both Kim and Chris Kimberly and Chris have touched on this earlier too, is that, you know, it's data literacy, and what does that mean for us? And you know, where do we go with it? And I think, Chris, when you talk about responsibility, and I think that's a huge part, is that, yeah, who are our data statisticians? Who are our data gatherers and collectors? And how are we taking up the responsibility to really tell that good story? Because there are good stories out there to be told. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Bridget. And Kimberly, for a final comment.
Yeah, I would just agree. I think, you know, we need to encourage Indigenous youth to get more involved and build community capacity for with this data literacy piece. And I think I would extend that, you know, beyond Indigenous communities. I think Canadians or, you know, people in all countries need to have some influence over the way that data is collected and analyzed and portrayed. You know, only then are we going to start to understand, you know, really where this governance and stewardship and some of the other requirements, the changes need to occur.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you for all this really useful conversation, and for the lively input of our chat on the side here too. It's been great to have that on the side going on. I will turn to Lino to give him a few minutes before we top the hour here, and look forward to seeing everyone at our next webinar. Over to you, Lino.
Thank you, Janet. Maybe just one point here that might summarize at least part of the conversation, and which is something that Chris mentioned in his presentation in the beginning, that data are always political, and good data results from the quality of the partnership, and so the relationship of trust has to come first in collecting data and deciding what data is being collected and how it is collected. But we are, as Jeanette mentioned in the beginning, we did 6 webinars last year. We had close to 1,300 people who participated. Those are a variety of different discussions, from gender equality to literature to indigenous knowledge and science, etc. And we are continuing this. This is the first one of this type this year. We have done already 2 in partnership that are more business related, on doing business in Canada and energy and clean tech. We are working with Wire on a seminar on April 12th, developing skills in the Arctic renewable energy sector. On April 12th, we're also doing a geothermal webinar for the Canadian North and Arctic, where we have specialists from Iceland discussing and presenting on how geothermal is done in Iceland and our past regarding geothermal. We have a food and natural products market entry seminar webinar in April. But then May 18th, we have a webinar on diversity and inclusion that we are flushing out the agenda, etc. And in the fall, also a webinar on destination management in the North and the Arctic, so related to tourism. So this is what we have on the agenda for this year. Will probably be maybe 1 or 2 others. We are constantly getting ideas on new topics, so we might add something in the fall as well. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Chris, Kimberly, and Bridget for the panel and for a great conversation. And Janet, and everyone have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.